Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A gute Woche, a good week. We continue the journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights, LLC, and it is in loving honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg and Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz, Olav Shalom. It is also dedicated in honor of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz, Le'edich Yomim B'Shalom Tevis, many healthy years. This week's program is also dedicated by David Schatzkammer. And above all, I want to dedicate this program to the 45 nefoshes, beautiful souls, that perished this past Lag BaOmer. What better way to honor them than by studying Primus HaTeira, as it is in the Sefer HaTanya, which is, of course, rooted in the Rashbi, Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, where this great tragedy happened in Miron. Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar. So this program is dedicated to them. May their families be consoled. May all those that need a complete refuah shlema have a speedy and complete healing. And we should only know simchas going forward. So where are we? We're in the second half of the first chapter of Tanya. And we have now introduced, the Alter Rebbe has introduced, the doctrine of the two souls. It's critical to understand this well because this is going to set the stage and set the tone for the continuing chapters, and above all, for us understanding ourselves. What makes us tick? So he began with the nefesh, the first soul within every Jew, what he called the nefesh achas mitzad haklipa v'sitra achra. Later, this is going to be called nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. Essentially, it's the biological spirit within each one of us that gives us life, all the functionality of life, walking, talking, hunger, eating, sleeping, everything that consists of what we define biological life goes into this category, this nefesh achas. Now, of course, part of that is also the selfish nature of a human being, the egocentric nature, which is why it's called klipa v'sitra achra. As we explained, klipa means a shell, a husk. What is the significance of a shell? The shell conceals the fruit within. The fruit within is the divine soul that we will learn about in chapter 2. It's the purpose of life. It's the transcendent element of our beings, not the biological. The biological, in many ways, is like an animal. And that's not per se bad. An animal is all about survival. Breeding, protecting its young, eating. Like the Gemara says that in 3 ways we're similar to a behemoth. And then there are 3 things that were similar to malachim. But that's the divine soul. So let's talk about this, continuing talking about this animal soul. So it's like a klippa. In essence, it's necessary because it protects the fruit within. Where does it become something negative is when you forget that there's a fruit. And the biological life that you live becomes an end in itself. That you eat and sleep and drink and take care of your needs as an end in itself. Forgetting that you were created l'shamish eskeni, to serve God. The klippa, the shell, is there only to protect the fruit. In other words, the fruit is like the nitzutz aleki, the divine aspect, which all things we do in this world should be directed toward. Now, we're going to learn later, especially in chapter 6 and 7, how we should be directing the biological part of our lives, this klippas nega, toward godliness. But it's also possible to go in the other direction. So that's what he says, that from this nefesh, which manifests within the blood, which is the biological part, umemena boys kol hamidas rois ma'arbi yeseidas haroim. Ma'arbi yeseidas haroim. This is also the root of all the negative characteristics of a human being. As we discussed, that the four archetypes of Eish, Mayim, Ruach, Ofar, fire, water, air or wind, and earth, reflect four characteristics that have negative elements to them. Just briefly to go over it again. What are the four? These are part of biological life. Every human being has these characteristics, these temperaments, these proclivities. And they are anger and arrogance from fire, physical gratification and pleasures from water, silliness, mockery, boasting, worthless discussion, dvarim b'telim, that comes from air. And finally, atzvus and atzvus, laziness and depression, from ofar. We're now going to continue learning inside that at the same time, there are also positive traits. An animal soul doesn't mean it's a bad thing. There's also positive. Even on a biological level, we're not even talking about divine aspirations. There are also very many positive elements to a behemoth, and definitely also to nefesh habamis. Because remember, we're talking now about klipas neiga. Klipa v'sitra achra. So before we go there, let me just clarify what this klipas noiga is, because it'll help us understand what we're going to learn in a moment. He's going to talk about klipas neiga. So before we learn it inside, basically, to put it in very simple terms, in this world in which we live, there are three tracks. There are things that we must do, a mitzvah, or dover shebekdusha, something that's holy, sanctified, that we have, and the same thing like a mitzvah, an obligation. Then there's the other extreme, things we're not allowed to do, an isur, an aveda. So it's the opposite of kedusha. The opposite of holiness is the opposite of holiness, tumah, toxic, impure. And then there's the majority of our activities and things in this world go in the third category. In halacha would be called divrei reshus. What does reshus mean? It's neutral, and you can use it either way. Eating, sleeping, doing business. We're not talking about something that's inappropriate or forbidden. So you can eat l'shem shamayim, with the purpose of thinking about God. You can eat just neutrally, without any intention. You can eat with an intention, just self-indulgence. Again, this will be explained later in chapter 6 and 7. The first one, kedusha, is called a nitzutz aliki. It's a divine manifest, as we're going to learn again later. The other extreme is called shalosh klipas hatmeis, which means the three impurities, and they are actually off limits. One is not supposed to go there, even though they do have a divine spark, but the divine spark is trapped there and being held hostage. All this will be explained later in Tanya. And then there's the middle. The neutral areas, are basically called klipas nega. It means a bright husk, a bright shell. In contrast to, for example, to a nut. A nut, whether it's a filbert or a walnut or a coconut, these are thick shells and very hard to pierce. So that's an example for the things that are off limits. On the other hand, for example, the shell or husk or peel of a grape or of an olive is a membrane that is transparent. That's why it's called nega. It shines through, but it's still a klippa, meaning it's still a husk. So this husk, because it's not quite as thick and entrapping the divine energy within it, here you can use it in each direction. And as a result, we have that the biological soul, which is connected to this level called Klippas Nega. He didn't use Nega yet. We'll use it now in a few minutes. The next lines in Tanya. That's why biological life is essentially the life we were given in this world. No one calls it bad. No one calls it good. It could lead to an egocentric life if you focus on the klippa as an end in itself, on the husk, looking at money and food and all the pleasures of this world and all its delights and all its beautiful elements as an end in itself, then it becomes like the source of, we said, of the four different elements that lead to different negative characteristics. But it could also be used for the positive. And as a matter of fact, the Rab Chaim Vital in the Shari Hagdusha, he actually explains how Eish Roch Mai Mufar are also on the positive side. The Alter Rebbe doesn't quote that. But he does continue, and with this we'll understand that the same biological soul that we're talking about now, this Nefesh Achas Mitzad HaKlippa V'Sitra Achre, biological life, just as it is the root, Memena Bos Kol HaMidas Rois, all the negative characteristics, he continues now, and we continue learning inside. He says like this now. V'gam midas tevis, shebeteva kol Yisrael, v'tuldosam. But also the positive characteristics, which is inherent in the natural Jew. He says, midas tevis shebeteva kol Yisrael v'tuldosam, that they're naturally born with them. They're innate. So there are also positive characteristics. Like the Gemara says, Kamoi, Rachmanis, V'gem Lichsodim. The Gemara in Yevomis, Ayin Tes Aleph 79a says that the Jews have natural, Teva, they're Rachmanim, Gem Lichasodim. So Rachmanis V'gemilas Chasodim, Bois Memeno, also are derived compassion and generosity. That's these two qualities that we just said, Rachmanis v'gemilas chasodim. Also, compassion and generosity stem from the animal soul, from the biological soul. So just that it can lead to a negative characteristic, it also has positive characteristics. Now, of course, the obvious question is, why doesn't he mention the third thing, Baishonim, that they have shame, they have busha, a sense of shyness in a sense. So the Rebbe, the Bavitcher Rebbe, in his commentary on Tanya, explains, because Baishonim is something that came to the Jews by Matan Torah. Naturally, there's a certain azus. They also have a certain chutzpah. So the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring it. That's what the Rebbe says in explaining it. So because at the end of the day, it's not about citing the Gemara. He wants to make a point, so he doesn't want to complicate matters. So he brings the two Rachmanim V'gem Lechasodim, Rachmanis V'gemilas Chasodim. But bottom line is, we're talking now by the biological soul of the Jews' natural tendencies. So you could seemingly argue, one second, maybe these good qualities are connected to the divine soul. The Chelik Elikam Emal Mamas Nefesh Alikis that we're going to learn about in Perek Beis. So a few points also the Rebbe clarifies. Number one, these come naturally to the Jew. They don't require a milchama. If it's required a battle, which we're going to learn later in Tanya, what is the battle? The battle between the animal soul and the divine soul. So if these qualities came from the divine soul exclusively, then there would need to be a battle. And we see it doesn't come as a battle, it's natural. But then what's the difference, Ebazé? What's the difference between the divine soul's positive qualities and the animal soul's? So one of the explanations is biological soul, biological life, even if it's focused on self, does not mean we don't have virtues. Human beings have virtues. You could say the virtues are not perhaps divine and completely focused on God, but even on a selfish level, there are virtues. Number one, we can do a favor to another because we get something in return. But we won't talk about that because that may be a different category. But you do a favor because it's part of the natural human being is to be a more refined person. Refinement is not mutually exclusive to the divine soul. Even though, of course, it lifts it to a completely different category. Because there you introduce bittul, a type of selflessness. Here, the animal soul, animals, for example, let's talk about a behemoth itself. Behemoths are not just wild creatures and only violent and aggressive. They also have compassion. We see they have compassion to their young, and they can also have compassion to other species. Yeah, obviously there are different types of animals. So the fact is that something is a behemoth, which means it focuses on survival and its biological life, does not necessarily mean it's completely destructive to others. So virtue can also be part of the natural soul. Now, of course, lahavdil, we're not talking about a behemoth, we're talking about nefesh abamis, of the nefesh achas b'Yisrael. And we're talking here a feature that the Gemara in Yevamah says is unique to the Jewish people, that they're compassionate and generous. So those two things also come from the biological element. Now, just also good to point out that it shows us that it's not just that the animal soul within us is completely a negative element. It has many positive things that need to be harnessed. And even what we spoke before about the midas rois, about the negative characteristics, can also be channeled, transformed, directed, and harnessed. But what we're just talking about, this soul on its own, essentially has, I said, biological life. It has tendencies that can be negative characteristics, but also positive ones. That's what he established now. Ki b'Yisrael, continuing on, Ki b'Yisrael nefesh zu, the klipa hi meklipas nega. Why is it the case that this biological dimension, soul, is by Yisrael has also a positive tendency? Because it comes from klipas nega. Because in the case of Jewish people, this biological soul of klipa is from what's called klipas nega. As I mentioned, nega from the word bright, illuminate, transparent, shining, which contains sheyesh bo gam kein tev. Because klipas nega, as I said earlier, is not mutually exclusively negative. Sholosh klipas atmeyes is trapped in a place that is off limits. Things that are not allowed, things that are considered completely impure and toxic. Klipas nega is an in-between. It's the essential DNA of existence. Existence by nature is not a negative thing. The concealment of the divine can lead to negative, but it's not fundamentally negative. We were sent to this world and we were told to engage in the world. We engage in the matters of materialism, in the material world, in eating and drinking and doing business and all the other needs, shelter, clothing. So that's called klipas nega, that neutral middle space, divrei reshus. So he says, so this, the klipas nega, sheyesh bo gam kein tev. It also includes in it sparks. Later we'll learn the divine sparks of good is also included. V'hi meseid eitz hadas tevera. And these two elements that we just described, klipas nega, that has good and evil in it, in other words, negative characteristics, this results from, he says, soid, the secret of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Yeah. This is discussed in Eitz Chaim. So when we say Eitz Hadas Tevera, let's talk about that for a moment. Of course, it's a verse and a story in the Chumash that everybody knows, that after Adam and Eve were created, they were placed in the Garden of Eden, and Hashem showed them, he put them all different trees, tree of life. He said, you shall eat from this tree, Eitz HaChaim. But here's a tree called Eitz Hadas Tevera. The day you eat from it, when you know good and evil, that will cause death in the world. But what's the meaning, Tevera? It's not just Eitz Hara, it's Eitz HaTevera. Eitz Hadas Tevera. Because this is essentially, this tree captures the essence of existence. An existence that on one hand God created, but on the other hand God allowed for two options. Like later in the verse we learn in the Chumash, we say, I give you two paths, a path of life and a path of death. God forbid. A healthy path aligned with what I, God, wants, and a path that defies what I want. You shall choose the path of life. Eitz Hadas personifies that. So it's more than just a tree. It's a tree that has both elements to it. And that's the root of Klipas Nega, that once they ate from it, they released these two possibilities. These two possibilities, which is positive, negative characteristics or positive ones. So here we have it. So when it comes to the Nefesh, B'Yisrael, the Nefesh Habamis even, has in it the biological life, has in it elements that can be very selfish and thus lead to all the different negative characteristics we spoke about. Whether it's arrogance, anger, and arrogance, whether it's indulging in the pleasures, whether it's nonsense and mockery and so on, or it's laziness and depression. But it also has the possibility for positive things. Like we spoke, the example being compassion and generosity. All within the biological soul. Okay. One more thing to point out before we continue reading, because now he's going to contrast it with the non-Jewish world. The point I want to make here is, and I mentioned it in last shir, we're talking here not just about tendencies people have. We're talking about nefoshes, neshamas aniyasisi. He calls it a soul, a spirit. So it's a whole nefesh. It's not just a voice or a certain tendency, an inclination. It's a nefesh. The nefesh per se is a divine creation, including this first nefesh, is the divine creation of biological soul, of a soul that gives the human being life, and together with life come many possibilities, and a human being can choose. Obviously later in Tanya we're going to talk about those choices we make. But right now what he's putting focus on is there's a nefesh like this. We're soon going to learn about the divine soul. It's a very different personality, completely focused on its purpose and God. This is a creation of God's, of what he wants in this world. Now, of course, a behemoth itself doesn't have free will, so nothing wrong with an animal. When God created an animal, he wants the animal to be exactly the way it is, and an animal never changes or wavers from God's plan. It's the human being who has free will. So it's not just by the behemoth within us just to survive. It can end up also causing damage, as we discussed before. That if the klipa just focuses on itself and not on its purpose, the fruit within, it can lead to all kinds of negative behavior and negative impact. But at the same time, there's also the positive. So now in contrast to what he just said, the nefesh b'Yisrael, remember this whole thing began that there's two nefoshes, that what it says in the Shari HaGedusha. By the way, Shari HaGedusha is one of the names used. Some people, sometimes it's called Shar HaGedusha, and sometimes it's called Shari Gedusha. So, just for the record, if you look in the Tanya, in our printed Tanya, it says Shari Gedusha. Shar HaGedusha rather, Shar HaGedusha. But in other places, the Rebbe corrects in the different prints that it says Shari HaGedusha or Shari Gedusha. Okay. So when he began, what did he say? L'chol ish Yisrael echad tzadik v'echad roshi yashtei neshamas. But now he's going to introduce, what about not Yisrael? The majority of the world, the nations of the world. So he's going to contrast it, because we just said that the klipa, the nefesh zu, ki b'Yisrael nefesh zu the klipa, is klipas nega. Which immediately tells you there's another type of nefesh that's not from klipas nega. And now he's going to bring in shalosh klipas atmeis. Now this is a very critical piece to really understand well. Before we learn this inside about the nations of the world, I want to give a short preface. This coming piece that we're going to learn has evoked and provoked much controversy. Because when you read it on surface level, especially an outside person who doesn't know better, would think it's very racist. But as we shall understand, it's nothing at all like that. And the most important thing to remember, and I'll elaborate as we learn it, most important thing to remember here is that we are not talking about an individual. Just like we just discussed about Neshamas of Yisrael, Neshamas Yisrael, the Nefesh B'Yisrael. The Alter Rebbe is not talking about a particular Jew. He said, Echad Tzaddik, Echad Rasha. Different people manifest different elements. Some people, unfortunately, their animal soul is very dominant. And other people, the divine soul is very dominant, as we shall learn later in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe is talking here about the archetype, the personality type of this soul. So when he's going to talk now about the nations of the world, he's not talking about a particular individual. He's talking about this archetype. Because we know in Torah, before Matan Torah, halachically, there was no such thing as a Jew, a Yisrael, or a non-Jew. There are Sforim that talk about Avram Avinu, the Ovis, what Geder they had. But by Matan Torah, all the Eden went through a Gedus. They went through a conversion. Actually, all laws of conversion come from what we derive from the laws of Matan Torah. What happened there? Mikveh, Milah, Kabbalas mitzvahs. So when we think of Jews and non-Jews, it's not just about individuals. We're talking also about two archetypes. Exactly like what Rivka was told by Hashem when she talked about the struggles she's having inside during pregnancy. These are two nations inside of you. They present diametric opposite objectives. One is driven by the material of this world, and one is driven by God. And they will struggle. When one will rise, the other one will fall. So it's important to remember that Alter Rebbe is discussing it in that context. So when you know that, it'll help us understand what he's going to say now regarding the nefashos of Umas Evdei Gilulim. Evdei Gilulim literally means the nations of the world, but in the original Evdei Gilulim are the people who serve idolaters, people who served idols. But due to the limit in time, I'm just going to share the general point, and inside we'll learn the next year. The general point he's going to say is that this archetype, called the nations of the world, focuses primarily on complete self. And their nefesh, he says, is going to say, is mishar klippus ha-tmeis, she'ein behen tev klal, that on their own don't have any goodness within them. Now, of course, what does that mean? So, of course, this is why I need to have more time, and we'll explain it the next year. We also have to understand what about Chassidim Meselim, they're righteous Gentiles. We also talk about all the different verses, B'Tselem, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, because every human being was created in the divine image. The righteous Gentiles have a place in the world to come. The Rambam says the whole world will be filled with divine knowledge, and the nations of the world will know God. So all of this will be explained in the next year. We have now a special website called Tanya Applied, TanyaApplied.com, where you can pose any questions you like, any comments, as well as watch all the previous programs. Everyone have a good week. Kol Tuv, and stay healthy.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChassidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.